They called it the Warsaw Ghetto, a prison carved out of a city where 500,000 souls were crammed into less than 3 square miles. By the winter of 1940, the Nazis had sealed the walls, and life inside began to decay faster than anyone could imagine. Disease, hunger, and fear became the language of survival. But somewhere within that despair, one woman decided she would fight back, not with weapons, but with names. Her name was Irena Sendler. She was a quiet, unassuming social worker, just 30 years old, the kind of person who looked harmless, invisible even, and that invisibility became her greatest weapon. By day, Irena wore the armband of a public health inspector, a position that gave her official access to the ghetto. She carried medical forms, vaccination charts, and papers stamped with Nazi insignias to the guards. She was just another bureaucrat doing her duty, but inside her satchel, hidden beneath those official forms, were other papers, fake birth certificates, false identities, and tiny scraps of life waiting to be rewritten. At first, she smuggled medicine, then food, then children. The first child she saved was a baby girl, less than 2 years old. Her parents begged Irena to take her. They knew they would not survive much longer. So, under cover of night, Irena placed the child inside a wooden box, drilled small air holes, and carried it out through the back of an ambulance marked with a red cross. She passed through the ghetto gates, heart pounding, praying the guards wouldn't hear the faint sound of breathing. That night, one life was saved. But that one act lit a fire that would not go out. Irena gathered a small circle of trusted friends, priests, nurses, even a few sympathetic policemen, and built a network so secret that even within it, no one knew every name. They called themselves Gestapo, the Polish underground organization that helped Jews escape the Nazi net. Through fake papers and forged seals, they placed children in convents, orphanages, and with Christian families across Poland. Every escape had to be flawless. One mistake, one inconsistency in the paperwork, and a child could vanish forever. And so Irena created a system. Each child's real name, the name of their parents, and their new identity were written on tiny slips of paper. She sealed them in glass jars, fragile time capsules of truth, and buried them beneath a tree in her neighbor's garden, one jar after another, hundreds of names hidden under the earth, waiting for the day they could be reunited. Inside the ghetto, parents faced the most impossible choice: hand their child to a stranger, perhaps never to see them again, or keep them, and almost certainly watch them die. Irena's soft voice became the last sound many parents heard before the silence of goodbye. She promised them one thing: I will remember their names. As the years passed, her operation grew bolder. Children were smuggled out in toolboxes, under piles of laundry, in coffins, even inside sacks of potatoes. Every life saved meant risking her own, and those who helped her knew the price if they were caught. But Irena refused to stop. When asked later how she found the strength, she said quietly, I was raised to believe that when a man is drowning, you must jump in to save him, even if you cannot swim. In 1943, her luck ran out. Someone betrayed her. The Gestapo stormed her apartment, arresting her before she could burn her notes. They tortured her for hours, demanding the names of the children, the addresses of families, the location of her buried jars. Her legs were broken, her feet shattered. She never spoke a word. The Nazis sentenced her to death. But on the day of her execution, something extraordinary happened. Jagoda bribed a German guard. He slipped her name onto a list of prisoners already executed, and let her escape. The world thought Irena Sendler was dead. In truth, she went underground, continuing her mission in silence until the war ended. When the Nazis finally fell, she returned to the garden, dug beneath the tree, and unearthed the jars, dirt-stained, fragile, filled with names written years before. One by one, she delivered them to the new Jewish committees, hoping to reunite the children with surviving relatives. Most had lost their entire families. Some never learned who they really were. But 2,500 children lived because one woman refused to let them vanish into history. When the war finally ended, Warsaw was no longer a city, it was a scar across the earth. The streets where children once played had become valleys of rubble and ash. Buildings stood like hollow skeletons, their windows shattered, their walls blackened by fire. And somewhere in that silence, a woman limped across the ruins, holding on to one fragile thought: the jars. Irena Sendler's body was broken, but her memory was sharper than ever. She returned to the garden where she had buried the names of 2,500 children, teeny pieces of paper that carried the truth of those who had almost been erased. The apple tree that had once offered shade now looked like a shadow of itself, its bark burned, its branches dry. Still, it was there, and so was hope. She dropped to her knees and began to dig. The soil was cold and heavy, damp from the spring thaw. Her fingers clawed through the earth until they struck glass. When she pulled the first jar free, it was coated in mud, the paper inside fogged with moisture. She wiped it clean with the edge of her sleeve, holding it close to her chest. It was real. The names had survived. The promise she had made in whispers to terrified parents had not been lost to war. She found more jars, some cracked, some sealed tight. Each one carried stories she could still hear if she closed her eyes. A mother begging her to keep the child safe. A father slipping her a photograph. A little hand that didn't want to let go. She carried the jars home like sacred relics. At her kitchen table, she opened them one by one, spreading the fragile slips of paper in front of her. The ink had faded, but the letters were still their wobbly handwriting, names that still had weight. The war had ended, but her work had not. The children had been scattered across Poland, hidden in convents, orphanages, and families who had risked everything to protect them. Now, she needed to find them again. But how do you trace lives that have been rewritten by fear and time? Post-war Poland was chaos. Trains carried refugees back to cities that no longer existed. Jewish committees formed, desperately searching for anyone who might still be alive. Irena arrived with her jars, her quiet archive of hope. The people in those offices didn't know who she was. They just saw a thin woman with bandaged legs, holding a box of dirty glass jars. But when she opened them and the lists were revealed, the room went silent. For months, she worked alongside volunteers, comparing her notes with lists of survivors. Sometimes, a child recognized a name. Sometimes, there was nothing, only actors in the streets were filled with children who didn't know their own names, who had forgotten their language, who prayed in ways that weren't their own. Irena would kneel beside them, looking into their eyes and asking softly, "Do you remember a lullaby, a smell, anything?" Some did, some shook their heads. Many didn't answer at all. When a reunion did happen, it was like a heartbeat restarting, a mother recognizing her son by a small scar, a grandmother collapsing in tears as a child whispered a word she hadn't heard in years. For every reunion, there were dozens that would never come. Still, Irena kept searching. If their parents cannot be found, she said, then the world must be their witness. But the world was already beginning to change again. By 1948, Poland was under Soviet rule, and a new kind of fear spread through the country. The new government celebrated soldiers and revolutionaries, not women who had defied the Nazis through faith and underground networks. Irena's story did not fit the new narrative. She was a Catholic, a member of the resistance, a woman who had acted on conscience rather than ideology, and that made her dangerous. Her name disappeared from newspapers. Her achievements were omitted from public memory. The people she had worked with were scattered or silenced. And so she adapted once more. She returned to her quiet life, teaching nursing, caring for the sick, and avoiding attention. To her students, she was simply Professor Sendler, a gentlewoman who walked with a limp and spoke about kindness as though it were a form of strength. No one knew that those same hands had once carried babies through the gates of death. Her apartment was small, lined with books and photographs. On a shelf, she kept the empty jars washed, polished, glinting softly in the sunlight. To her, they weren't trophies. They were reminders. Every jar represented a promise kept. Years passed. She raised her own children, watched the seasons change outside her window, and said nothing about what she had done. When people asked why she never spoke of the past, she replied quietly, because it was the right thing to do. You don't brag about breathing. In 1965, a letter arrived from Israel. Yad Vashem had learned of her story and named her righteous among the nations, an honor given to those who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. But when she tried to travel to Jerusalem to receive the medal, the Polish government refused her permission. They didn't want the world to remember that Poland's courage had come from individuals, not from its politics. She received the medal years later in private. There was no ceremony, no applause. She placed it beside her bed and said nothing. The reward, she once told a visitor, was that the children lived. By the 1970s, her name had nearly vanished from history. She lived quietly, her story reduced to whispers among those who had known her during the war. But memory is patient, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds its way back to the surface. It began again, far away, across an ocean. In 1999, 4 American students at a small Kansas high school were searching for a topic for their history project. They wanted a story no one had told before. While digging through old archives, they stumbled upon a short note about a woman in Poland who had saved thousands of Jewish children during the Holocaust. Her name, Irena Sendler. There were no books about her, no documentaries, just a name and a number, 2,500 lives. The students were stunned. How could such a person exist and not be famous? They decided to find her. They wrote letters to embassies, archives, and museums. For months, they heard nothing. Then, one day, an envelope arrived. It was postmarked from Warsaw. Inside was a short letter written in careful, elegant handwriting. "I am very old now," it read. "I did what was right. There were others who did more." It was signed Irena. The students were astonished. They turned their research into a play called Life in a Jar. They performed it at their school, then in nearby towns, and soon across the country. Each performance brought more attention, more tears, more astonishment that such courage had been forgotten. The story reached Poland, then Israel, and eventually the entire world. Journalists traveled to Warsaw to meet her. They found a small woman in her 90s, sitting in a wheelchair, surrounded by flowers and stacks of letters. Her smile was soft, her eyes still bright. When asked how she felt about the sudden attention, she said, "It is not my story. It belongs to the children." She refused to be called a hero. "Heroes do extraordinary things," she told reporters. "I only did what any human should do." But to everyone else, she was proof that the smallest acts of conscience can shape the fate of thousands. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. When the journalists told her, she smiled faintly and said, "The prize belongs to the mothers who gave me their children." Even in her final years, she refused to accept credit. Her humility disarmed everyone who met her. She spent her last years writing letters to the survivors she had saved as children. Some came to visit her, bringing their children and grandchildren. They called her Mama Irena. She would hold their hands and tell them, "Your parents were the brave ones. I only helped." In May 2008, Irena Sendler passed away peacefully at the age of 98. The city that had once ignored her stopped that day to remember. Her funeral was quiet, yet hundreds gathered: survivors, families, students, strangers. They carried white roses, the color of remembrance. As her coffin passed through the streets of Warsaw, the same city that had once erased her name now whispered it in gratitude. Among the crowd stood many of the children she had saved, and now elderly themselves, holding photographs of families that would never have existed without her. For them, she was more than a rescuer. She was proof that one person's courage could stand against the machinery of evil. Beneath the apple tree where she had once buried the jars, a plaque now stands. It reads, "Under this ground were buried the names of 2,500 children saved from the Warsaw Ghetto by Irena Sendler." Visitors leave flowers, candles, and small folded notes with their own children's names, because Irena's story is not just a chapter of history, it is a reminder of what humanity looks like when the world forgets it. She showed that heroism can live in silence, that resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides names in jars. She never sought power. She never asked for recognition. Her weapon was empathy. Her rebellion was love. In a world that tried to erase truth, she buried it deep enough for the next generation to find. And so the earth remembers. The tree still grows. The names live on. Her name was Irena Sendler, and because of her, 2,500 children, every child who came after them, still have names, faces, and futures that evil could not erase.